In the year 1544, a baker in the Dutch province of Friesland slid a loaf of black rye bread into a brick oven, sealed the door with clay, and walked away for 16 hours. When he came back the next morning, he pulled out something that barely resembled bread. It was dense as a paving stone, dark as wet earth, and so heavy a single loaf could feed a family for most of a week. He wrapped it in cloth, set it on a shelf, and thought nothing of leaving it there. 3 weeks later, it was still good. No mould, no stoling. In a damp farmhouse with no refrigeration and no preservatives, this loaf simply refused to go bad. This bread had a name: Roggebrood. And the Dutch built an entire food economy around the fact that it would outlast almost anything else in the house. Today, bread is the single most wasted food in America, thrown out faster than any other grocery item because it spoils so quickly. The Dutch had the opposite problem solved 500 years ago, with nothing but rye, water, and time. This is the story of how they did it, why it worked, and how you could make a version of it in your own kitchen. To understand why a loaf of bread became the most reliable object in a medieval Dutch household, you have to understand what the household was up against. The Low Countries in the 1500s were not an easy place to keep food. This was a landscape of reclaimed marsh, river delta, and coastal flat, much of it sitting at or below sea level. By the early 1600s, the Dutch were draining entire lakes to make farmland, projects like the Beemster Polder, finished in 1612, which sits roughly 3 metres below the surrounding water. The air in this country was damp almost year-round. For most foods, damp air is the enemy. It accelerates mould, rot and spoilage. A loaf of soft white wheat bread in a Dutch farmhouse in November might show mould within 3 or 4 days. And bread was not a side dish here. For ordinary people, bread was the meal. Estimates from the period suggest a working adult ate well over a pound of bread a day, sometimes closer to 2, with grain supplying more than half of all the calories a labourer consumed. Grain was the foundation of the entire diet. When the bread failed, there was no pantry of alternatives waiting behind it. A loaf that moulded was not a small loss. It was a meal gone, in a season when meals were not easy to replace, and the failure of bread to keep was a genuine threat to survival through the long, wet winters. There was another problem. Wheat did not grow well in much of this region. Wheat wants warm, dry, well-drained soil, and the Low Countries offered cold, wet, heavy clay. What did grow well was rye. Rye tolerates poor soil, cold springs, and short growing seasons, and it can be sown in autumn and harvested the following summer. It was the grain the land would actually give you. Across the whole belt of northern Europe, from the Netherlands through northern Germany to the Baltic, rye was the bread grain of the poor for exactly this reason, feeding far more of the continent's working population than wheat ever did. So the Dutch were handed 2 facts. They had to eat bread to live, and the grain they could grow was rye. The question was how to turn a difficult grain in a damp climate into something that would keep. The answer they arrived at was not a single recipe. It was a system, refined over generations, and almost every step of it was secretly fighting spoilage. What did they actually do differently? The first part of the system is the grain itself. Rye is not wheat with a different label. At the molecular level, it behaves like another material entirely. Wheat owes its fluffy, springy texture to gluten, a network of proteins that traps gas and gives bread its structure. Rye has gluten proteins too, but they do not link up into the same strong elastic web. What rye has instead is a high concentration of compounds called pentasans, sometimes called arabinoxylans, a type of fibre that absorbs and holds enormous amounts of water, several times its own weight. This single difference changes everything about the bread. A wheat loaf is mostly air held in a protein web. A rye loaf is a dense, water-saturated mass, and water held tightly inside fibre is water that is not available to do damage. Stalling, the process that turns bread hard and crumbly, is largely about water migrating and starch recrystallizing over time. Mold needs available surface moisture to grow. Roggebrood structure locks the water away on the inside, where it keeps the crumb moist for weeks, while leaving the surface too dense and dry for mold to easily colonize. A soft white loaf, by contrast, is almost designed to spoil. Its open, airy crumb holds loose moisture right at the surface, exactly where mold wants it. That handles the grain. But the grain alone was not enough. What was the second part of the system, the one most people have never heard of? It was the sourdough starter, what the Dutch called the zuurdesem. Long before anyone understood microbiology, bakers kept a living culture of wild yeast and lactic acid bacteria alive in a pot of fermented rye and water, feeding it and passing it down, sometimes for decades. A good culture was treated like an inheritance, carried between households and handed from one generation to the next. The dominant bacteria in these cultures belong to a family we now call Lactobacillus, the same broad group that sours milk into yogurt and ferments cabbage into sauerkraut. When this culture was mixed into the dough and left to ferment, the bacteria produced lactic and acetic acid. They drove the bread's pH down into acidic territory, often to between 3.9 and 4.3. And here is why that mattered. The bacteria and molds that spoil bread mostly cannot survive in a strongly acidic environment. The baker was not just leavening the loaf, he was turning the entire interior of the bread into a place where rot could not take hold. The sourness you taste in real rye bread is not only a flavour, it is a preservative baked directly into the chemistry of the loaf. There was also a practical reason rye demanded sourdough rather than ordinary yeast. Rye contains active enzymes called amylases that, if left unchecked, keep breaking the loaf's starch down into sugars even as it bakes, leaving the inside a sticky, gummy mess that never properly sets. The acid from the sourdough culture slows those enzymes down and conditions the rye's pentosans so the loaf can hold a structure at all. So the acid was solving three problems at once. It made the bread possible, it kept the crumb from turning to paste, and it made the bread last. Plain baker's yeast does none of those things. It makes gas and nothing else. 2 parts of the system down. What was the third and strangest step? It was the bake. And the Dutch bake for Roggebrood was unlike almost anything we would recognise as baking today. A normal loaf of bread bakes in a hot oven for 30 minutes to an hour. Roggebrood, in its traditional form, was baked low and impossibly slow. The loaf went into a brick oven that had been fired and then allowed to cool to a gentle, steady heat, well below the temperature you would use for ordinary bread. The oven door was sealed, often with a plug of clay or a rope of stiff dough, and the bread stayed inside for 12, sometimes 16 or more hours, frequently overnight on the oven's falling heat after the day's main baking was done. Nothing was wasted, not even the dying warmth of a cooling oven. What happens to grain over 16 hours of low sealed heat is not really baking in the ordinary sense. It is closer to a slow steam roast. With the moisture trapped inside the sealed oven, the loaf does not dry out and form a hard crust the way fast-baked bread does. Instead, the sugars and amino acids in the rye undergo a slow transformation called the Maillard reaction, the same browning chemistry that darkens roasted coffee and seared meat, and over many hours they caramelize deep into the loaf rather than just at the surface. This is what turned Roggebrood almost black all the way through, gave it a faintly sweet, malty taste, and drove off just enough surface moisture to seal the loaf without drying the inside. This same long, low sealed bake produced Roggebrood's close cousin one country over. In Westphalia, in northern Germany, the identical method made pumpernickel, a black rye loaf, so famously dense and long-keeping that some German bakeries steam theirs for up to 24 hours. The two breads are siblings born of the same problem, the same grain and the same climate. The long bake did one more thing. It thoroughly killed off any spoilage organisms that had survived the fermentation, essentially sterilizing the loaf as it finished. The bread came out of that oven not just cooked, but stabilized. So now you can see the full system. A grain that locks its water away. A fermentation that makes the loaf too acidic to rot. A bake so long it caramelizes and sterilizes the whole thing. Each step was a different defense against a different way that bread fails. And the result was a loaf that a family could keep on a shelf for weeks and slowly eat its way through, sliced wafer thin with a dedicated board and a long knife into pieces you could almost see through. The thinness was not delicacy, it was thrift. A dense loaf this rich went further cut fine, and a single baking could feed a household until the next one. Here is where the story takes a turn that nobody in the medieval Low Countries could have predicted. For centuries, Roggebrood was peasant food. It was dark, heavy, sour and cheap, the bread of farmers and labourers, while the wealthy ate soft white wheat bread as a mark of status. White bread meant you could afford imported wheat and a baker to make it light. Dark rye meant you worked the land. Across medieval Europe, the rule was almost universal. The whiter the bread, the higher the rank of the person eating it. But in the last few decades, science has quietly complicated that hierarchy, and it took until the 21st century to measure why. In 2003, a team of Finnish researchers led by Kirsi Juntunen published a study in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. They fed people refined white wheat bread and several dense rye breads, each matched to deliver the same amount of carbohydrate, and then measured what happened in the blood. The surprise was not really in the glucose, it was in the insulin. The rye breads required significantly less insulin to handle the same carbohydrate load than white bread did. The body simply did not have to scramble as hard to process the dense, acidic loaf. Follow-up work over the next several years filled in why that matters. Rye's tightly packed fibre-locked structure and its sourdough acidity tend to produce a flatter, more drawn-out blood sugar curve and a lower insulin peak, and that lower peak has been linked to steadier energy and a longer feeling of fullness, with less of the late crash that sends you back to the kitchen. The picture is not that rye magically erases the sugar. It is that the same density and acid that preserve the loaf also make your body process it more gently and stay satisfied longer. So the features that made Roggebrood last, the density, the acid, the whole grain, are close to the same features modern nutritional science now prizes. The peasant loaf that the medieval rich looked down on turns out to look a lot more like what a dietitian would recommend than the white bread that signalled wealth. The hierarchy that ran for 600 years was, by at least one modern measure, exactly upside down. The Dutch did not know any of this. They were trying to keep bread from rotting in a wet climate with the only grain they could grow. They stumbled into a nutritional profile that took laboratories until our lifetime to measure, by solving a completely different problem. Which raises the obvious question. If this bread keeps for weeks and is better for you than what is on the shelf, can you actually make it at home? You can. And you do not need a 16-hour brick oven to get most of the way there. Start with the starter. You need a rye sourdough culture, and you can grow one from nothing in about a week. Mix equal weights of whole rye flour and water in a jar, leave it loosely covered at room temperature, and discard half and refeed it with fresh flour and water once a day. For the first few days it may smell sharp or even unpleasant, which is normal as the right bacteria crowd out the wrong ones. Within 5 to 7 days, it will be bubbling, tangy, and reliably doubling between feeds. That culture is doing the same job the Dutch baker's pot did. It is your acid engine, and once established, it will live in your fridge for years on a weekly feed. Then the dough. Real Roggebrood is built almost entirely from whole rye, often coarse rye meal or cracked rye berries soaked overnight so they soften. Because rye has so little gluten, you do not need it like wheat dough, and you should not try. You stir it into a thick, sticky paste, mix in your active starter, and pack it firmly into a loaf tin, pressing out the air pockets. There is no airy rise to wait for. You let it ferment slowly, several hours or overnight, until it smells tangy and has puffed slightly and shows a few bubbles at the surface. The longer and cooler that ferment, the more acid you build, and the better the finished loaf keeps. Now the bake, which is where a home oven stands in for the medieval one. The principle is low and long and sealed. Cover the tin tightly with foil to trap the moisture inside and bake at a low temperature, somewhere around 250 to 285 degrees Fahrenheit, for several hours rather than one. Some home bakers set a pan of water on the oven floor to keep the air humid throughout. What you are recreating is that slow, moist, sealed environment that steam roasts the loaf and drives the Maillard browning deep into the crumb instead of burning a hard crust onto the outside. The loaf will darken slowly, and the kitchen will fill with that malty, almost chocolate smell that tells you the sugars are caramelizing. Then comes the step almost everyone skips, and it is the most important one for keeping. Do not slice it warm. When the loaf comes out, let it cool completely, then wrap it in cloth or paper and leave it for a full day, sometimes 2, before cutting. The dense interior needs that time to set, and for the moisture to redistribute evenly from the wet centre toward the drier crust. A Roggebrood cut straight from the oven is gummy and disappointing. The exact same loaf 2 days later is sliceable, firm, deeply flavoured, and will then keep on the counter, well wrapped, for a week or more. The waiting is not optional. It is the final part of the recipe, and it is the part the medieval baker understood instinctively when he set his loaf on a shelf and walked away. For roughly 600 years, the people of the Low Countries solved a problem we have largely handed back to a factory. They were living in a damp climate, eating bread as their primary food, with only a difficult grain to work with, and no refrigeration, no preservatives, no plastic packaging of any kind. What they had was rye, a pot of living sourdough, a brick oven, and an understanding passed down through generations of how to make those 3 things work together. So they made a bread that fought its own decay from the inside. The grain held the water, the acid held off the rot, the long bake sealed it shut, and a single black loaf could sit on a shelf for weeks and still feed a family. The remarkable part is not that they did it 500 years ago, it is that the whole method still works, with a jar of flour and water and a patient oven in your own kitchen today. If you found this valuable, hit subscribe. We dig up the forgotten knowledge the modern world traded away, not because the old ways were always better, but because some of them solved problems we now pay to solve all over again.